Halloween night had always held an eerie quietness in our farming community. But this year, it felt like the air was thicker, pressing down on us with an unfamiliar weight. The field stretched out under a pale, silver moon, casting twisted shadows that danced over the Scarecrow standing tall in Farmer Hendrick's field. It was nearly midnight, and I was trying to convince myself to get some sleep when the silence shattered. A scream, a blood-curdling, hollow cry that echoed through the night. It wasn't human, yet it wasn't anything natural either. The sound was low and guttural, rising and falling like a twisted melody, piercing through the calm and slicing into our bones. My heart hammered as I sat up, straining to listen. Another scream followed, trailing off into an agonizing whimper. The source was unmistakable. Farmer Hendrick's Scarecrow. My phone lit up with frantic messages from neighbors. "Did you hear that? It's coming from the field. Who's going out there?" Nobody wanted to be the first to investigate. Then, from the corner of my window, I saw flashlights bobbing through the fields. The farmers, including Old Man Hendricks himself, were gathering to find out just what could make a scarecrow scream. Not wanting to be left out, or, truthfully, not wanting to be alone, I grabbed my flashlight and threw on a jacket, heading out to join them. When I arrived at the edge of the field, the scarecrow stood in the moonlight, its burlap face twisted and frayed, shadows dancing across its form. The eerie silence had returned, as if the night itself held its breath. We all watched, waiting. Then, just as I thought maybe it was over, that we'd all imagined it, the scarecrow's mouth stretched wide in a scream that echoed through the fields once more. Everyone froze. It wasn't just fear. It was like the scream had grabbed hold of our muscles and refused to let go. We stared, paralyzed, as that sound clawed its way out of the scarecrow's hollow mouth, filling the air with an agony that didn't belong in our world. Finally, Hendricks broke the spell. "What in God's name?" he muttered, stepping forward, his flashlight trembling in his hand. I didn't know whether to stop him or follow him, but my feet moved of their own accord, and soon I found myself right behind him, close enough to hear the quickening of his breaths. "What if someone's playing a prank?" whispered Cal, the farmer from down the road, though his voice shook with doubt. "Some kid with a speaker out here, trying to scare us?" But as we got closer, it became clear this wasn't some elaborate joke. The scarecrow looked different up close, its straw-stuffed torso and gangly arms twisted at odd angles, almost as though it had been struggling. The burlap was worn and ripped, and something else glistened faintly where the fabric had torn. Hendricks lifted his flashlight to its face, and we saw it. Something dark and dried was smeared around the mouth, as if the scarecrow had been coughing up mud? No, it was darker than that. It looked like old blood. The wind picked up, rustling the nearby corn stalks, making them hiss and whisper, as if they were warning us to leave. But it was too late. We were committed now. "Look at its eyes," whispered Cal, pointing a shaking finger. The scarecrow's button eyes, which had once been mismatched and lopsided, looked almost human. They glistened under the light, as if they were wet, as if they were alive. Then, with a horrible, grinding sound, the scarecrow's head slowly tilted toward us, its mouth stretching open wider. We all stumbled back, falling over each other, gasping for air as the scream rose again. This time it was sharper, desperate, like it was crying out for help. It was then we noticed something sticking out from beneath the fabric of its chest, the pale white curve of a bone. The bone jutted out, unmistakably human, just below the scarecrow's sagging neck. Hendricks, pale and shaking, muttered, I never put anything like that in there." The bone looked old, worn with time, as though it had been buried and unearthed again and again. An icy chill washed over me as I realized what that meant. Someone or something had put it there. Cal, breathing heavily, whispered, "Who would do this? And why?" But before anyone could answer, the air filled with a soft rustling, like footsteps moving through the cornrows. We whipped our flashlights around, but the fields were empty, only shadows twisting in the breeze. Then the whispers started, Help! Me! The voice was faint, so quiet that it seemed to come from within our heads. But as the words grew louder, more distinct, I realized it was coming from the Scarecrow itself. The whispers started repeating, overlapping, becoming a chorus of voices, each one sounding desperate, pained, pleading. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The voices seeped into my mind, into my bones. They were relentless, chanting words I couldn't fully understand. But I did catch one phrase clearly, repeated over and over in a haunting rhythm. Find me. Let me rest. Farmer Hendricks's face was ashen. I've been on this land all my life, but I swear I've never seen anything like this. No one's ever been buried here, at least not that I know of. Another voice, different from the first, more sorrowful, cut through the whispers. He buried me, right where I fell. The Scarecrow's head jerked sharply, its empty eyes seeming to focus on us as the voices faded. The silence that followed was more chilling than the cries. It was Cal who finally said it. There's something in there, something human. Hendricks swallowed hard and backed away. I don't want any part of this. I don't care what it is, we need to leave it be. But I couldn't pull my eyes from the Scarecrow, from the dark spots where blood had seeped through the burlap, from the horror written in its very posture. It was as though every stitch, every twist of straw, held a memory of suffering. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and said, whatever this thing is, it's begging us to dig. The words hung heavy in the air, and I could feel the weight of every farmer's gaze turned to me. But nobody argued. Something about that Scarecrow's hollow, tormented cry told us this was no ordinary haunting. It was a plea. Hendricks, still shaken, mumbled, if we do this, we do it quick. And then we burn it. I don't want any spirit wandering on my land. He gestured to his barn, where he kept a collection of tools. Get some shovels. Cal and I nodded, our steps crunching through the dry soil as we made our way over to the barn. Even in the dark, the tools gleamed with a kind of foreboding. I grabbed an old spade, its wooden handle splintered with age, while Cal picked up a rusty shovel. The weight felt unnatural in my hands, as if it knew what we were about to uncover. When we returned, Hendricks was already prodding at the ground beneath the Scarecrow with a small flashlight, his face pale in its weak beam. Here, he whispered, pointing to a patch of dirt directly beneath the Scarecrow's feet. I don't know why, but I feel like this is where it wants us to dig. We all exchanged uneasy glances, then plunged the shovels into the earth. The soil was hard and unforgiving, as if it hadn't been disturbed in decades. We dug in silence, each shovel full of dirt feeling heavier than the last. After a few minutes, we'd made a shallow pit, and that's when Cal's shovel struck something solid. Thunk! We froze, the sound echoing ominously in the night air. Hendricks knelt down and brushed away the remaining dirt with trembling hands. Beneath the thin layer of soil, we saw it, a tattered piece of cloth, stained and decayed, clinging to something white. Another bone. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me as we uncovered what appeared to be a rib cage, and then the unmistakable curve of a skull. Hendricks cursed softly under his breath, backing away, his hand covering his mouth. Who is this? Cal stammered, his face pale, eyes wide with horror. Then, as if in answer, the Scarecrow released another tortured wail, louder than before. It echoed across the field, rattling us to the core, and in that scream, I swore I could hear a single word echoing in my mind. Justice. As the word faded, a chill crept over us, sharper than the night air, colder than anything I'd ever felt. I shuddered, and that's when I noticed something else. There, tangled in the roots of the Scarecrow's post, was an old silver locket, tarnished and bent, its chain wrapped tightly around the decayed bones. I reached for it with a shaky hand and managed to pry it loose. Inside the locket was a faded photograph, a young woman, her eyes solemn, staring straight at us as though she'd been waiting for this moment all along. The woman's face in the photograph was faint, but her eyes seemed to pierce through the years, staring right into our souls. There was a sadness in them, a haunting familiarity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Hendricks took a shaky breath. I know her. Or I think I do. He swallowed, his voice barely a whisper. That's Lily Mae. She went missing decades ago, before most of you even moved here. Cal and I exchanged glances, dread pooling in my stomach. The story was a half-forgotten legend around these parts, one parents would bring up in hushed tones, warning kids not to wander too far at night. Lily may have been a local girl, barely out of her teens. She'd vanished one Halloween night, never to be seen again. People had searched for her, but eventually, the town had chalked it up to her running away, seeking a new life somewhere far from here. But now, as we looked down at the skeleton half buried beneath the Scarecrow, the truth was all too clear. Lily Mae hadn't run away. She'd been buried here, hidden in plain sight, and her spirit, bound to this field, this cursed Scarecrow, had been waiting for someone to find her. As if in response to our discovery, the Scarecrow let out another guttural moan, its head tilting back, mouth stretched open in a silent scream that echoed only in our minds. Shadows shifted across its face, giving the burlap a fleeting resemblance to a human expression: pain, anguish, rage. "We have to call the police," I said, my voice breaking. Her family deserves to know." Hendricks, pale and sweating, shook his head. "You think anyone in this town wants to dig up old sins? Whoever did this, they're probably long gone. Or maybe not." His eyes flicked to the distant lights of the neighboring farms, his suspicion clear. "And if someone around here knows, well, they'd do anything to keep it buried." Before we could argue, a gust of wind tore across the field, carrying with it a faint, whispering chant, not from the Scarecrow this time, but from somewhere beyond. The words were indistinct, but the tone was clear. Angry, accusing, like the voices of the forgotten calling out to us. And then we saw them. Shapes in the cornfield, barely visible in the moonlight, but undeniably there. They moved slowly, swaying like stalks in the wind, eyes glinting with a dull, eerie glow. They surrounded us, figures half formed from shadow and mist, advancing silently toward the Scarecrow. Hendricks took a step back, crossing himself. This is cursed. We shouldn't have dug." But it was too late. The air grew colder as the figures closed in, circling around the Scarecrow, their hollow eyes locking onto each of us. I could feel their grief, their anger, pressing down on us like a weight, crushing and relentless. One of them, a shadow that looked disturbingly like a young woman with long, tattered hair, lifted an arm, pointing directly at us. And as she did, Lily Mae's voice rose above the others, her whisper cutting through the night like a blade. "Find him. Bring him here." The words seemed to root us in place, their meaning sinking in with a chilling clarity. Find him. Bring him here. Lily Mae's spirit wasn't just looking for justice. She was demanding it, calling on us to find whoever had left her here to rot. Hendricks was the first to break the silence. I can't go dredging up that past. What if it's someone we know?" His face was pale, his eyes darting back toward the safety of his home. "I'm no detective. Let someone else deal with it." But the figures in the field didn't seem to care about his fear. Their eyes glinted with cold fire as they stared him down, their shapes becoming more defined in the moonlight, men, women, children, their faces etched with expressions of sorrow, as if they too were trapped here, waiting for answers they'd never receive. Their voices joined Lily Mae's in a chant, whispering in a maddening harmony, "Justice. Justice." I felt an overwhelming urge to act. Whoever did this, they're probably still around, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. What if they've been living here all this time, watching us, knowing what they did? Cal nodded, a determined look crossing his face. "If that's true, then they need to pay." I say we start asking questions, even if it means shaking up the whole town. Hendricks shook his head vehemently, taking a few steps back. I'm not part of this. I won't have any spirits haunting my land. You two do what you want, but I'll have no more of it. He turned abruptly, making his way back toward the farmhouse, leaving Cal and me alone with the Scarecrow and the watchful eyes of the spirits. Cal looked at me, his jaw set. I'm in if you are, he said, gripping his shovel. We need to find out who killed Lily Mae, and anyone else these poor souls might be waiting for. We began our search that very night, starting with the older neighbors. Most of them were asleep, so we had to wait until dawn. By morning, the whole town was buzzing. Questions whispered through the air. Rumors circulated. People remembered Lily Mae, even those who hadn't spoken her name in years. We were met with wary glances, hushed conversations cut short as we walked by, but no one dared confront us directly. That's when we decided to visit Mrs. Jensen, the oldest resident in town. She was known for her sharp memory and an uncanny ability to recall every dark secret hidden within our town's history. Her house sat at the edge of town, a small, creaky structure weighed down by ivy and years of neglect. When she opened the door, her eyes met ours, narrow and knowing. I know why you've come, she said, her voice frail but firm. This town has long buried its sins, but some things refuse to stay in the ground. She invited us inside, and as we settled into her dimly lit living room, she began to tell us the story of Lily Mae. She wasn't just some girl, Mrs. Jensen whispered. She knew things. Secrets about people in this town that they'd have killed to protect. My blood ran cold as I listened. You think someone silenced her? She nodded, her eyes distant. Lily Mae was last seen with a man, one who lived just up the road. He was a respected farmer, quiet, kept to himself. But he had a temper, one he barely kept hidden. She paused, looking me dead in the eye. If he's still here, he's watching you, and he'll stop at nothing to keep his secret buried. The air around us grew heavy, pressing in on me, making it hard to breathe. Mrs. Jensen's voice dropped to a whisper. Beware the man with blood on his hands. He's among you, watching every move. Cal and I exchanged a glance, the weight of Mrs. Jensen's words sinking in. A respected farmer with a hidden temper. Someone who'd been around long enough to know everyone's secrets and to know how to silence them. It made my skin crawl, wondering who among our friends, neighbors, and trusted locals could be hiding something so monstrous. As we left her house, the morning light seemed duller, muted, as if the shadows had grown darker overnight. The town felt unfamiliar now, every passing face a potential suspect. People watched us as we walked down the main road, whispering, their expressions tight with fear and suspicion. We need to narrow it down, Cal muttered, scanning the faces around us. Someone who was here when Lily Mae disappeared. Someone who fits her description. I nodded. The older farmers, the ones who've been here for decades. We'll start there. But even as I said it, a knot of dread twisted in my stomach. I knew these men, shared meals with them, laughed with them. Could one of them really have done something so evil? We decided to start with Jim Thompson, one of the oldest and most respected men in town. He'd been around as long as anyone could remember, his family owning vast stretches of farmland. He was known for his quiet nature, but there were stories whispered late at night about how he'd been harsh, even brutal, when he was younger. Jim met us on his front porch, his eyes narrowing as he saw us approach. "What do you boys want?" he grumbled, his tone guarded. I felt my mouth go dry, but I forced myself to speak. "Jim, do you remember Lily Mae?" For a moment, he just stared at us, his expression unreadable. Then his gaze hardened. "Why are you dredging up ghosts, boy? The dead ought to stay dead." "We found her," Cal said quietly, his voice steady. "In Hendricks Field. She was buried under his Scarecrow." Jim's face went pale, his eyes flashing with something, fear, maybe guilt, or just plain anger. "You think that's my doing?" he snapped, his voice low and dangerous. "I've got nothing to do with that poor girl's fate. Someone in this town does. I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't just disappear. She was murdered. And the Scarecrow. She's asking for justice. The silence between us stretched, thick and suffocating, until Jim finally spoke, his tone softer, but no less menacing. You two boys better stop playing detective. People around here don't take kindly to accusations. Keep stirring the pot, and you'll end up digging your own graves. With that, he turned and went back into his house, slamming the door behind him. Cal exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. You see that look in his eyes? He knows something. I nodded, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. But he's not going to talk. Not unless we push him. As we left Jim's house, heading back through the field, a strange feeling crept over me. I couldn't shake the sense that we were being watched. The corn rustled, shadows shifting in ways that didn't match the wind. Every step felt heavier, as if the earth itself resisted our movement, urging us to leave this dark secret buried. Then, as we reached the edge of the field, we saw it. The Scarecrow had been repositioned, its head tilted slightly toward us, its hollow eyes watching us with an intensity that hadn't been there before. And there, tied to its post, was a scrap of faded fabric. The same fabric we'd seen wrapped around Lily Mae's remains. The wind picked up, and from somewhere deep in the shadows, I heard her voice again, a whisper, urgent and close. Bring him to me. The Scarecrow's mouth opened slightly, as if it were waiting for the man with blood on his hands to face the spirit he'd tried so hard to silence. The whisper filled the air, almost tangible, pressing against us with a weight I could barely stand. I looked at Cal, and he nodded, his face set in grim determination. We both knew what had to be done. Jim Thompson had to face her. We would bring him back to this field, no matter the cost. As dusk fell, we returned to Jim's house, armed with the knowledge that we were now in a dangerous game. The farmhouse loomed, its windows dark, as if the place itself held its breath. We knocked on the door, each thud echoing like a countdown. After a tense silence, Jim finally answered, his expression one of wary defiance. "Didn't I tell you boys to stop digging?" he muttered, eyes darting between us. "Jim," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "we found something else. Out by the Scarecrow. It's calling for you." For a split second, his face betrayed something, terror, regret, something deeper. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice cracked, betraying him. "Lily Mae won't rest," Cal said, his tone low but firm. "She wants you to see what you did. She wants justice. Come with us, Jim." Jim shook his head, sweat beading on his forehead. "I don't know anything about that girl. That was years ago. She's gone, just like everyone else who vanishes from this cursed town." "Then what are you afraid of?" I asked, pushing him, seeing the fear flicker in his eyes. "If you didn't do anything, then you have nothing to fear. Come with us, and put it to rest." He hesitated, the weight of his secrets pressing down on him until, finally, he grabbed his coat and muttered, "Fine, let's get this over with." We walked in silence toward the field, Jim's footsteps heavy, dragging, as if the earth itself tried to hold him back. By the time we reached the Scarecrow, darkness had fully settled, and the moon cast eerie shadows across the twisted burlap face, giving it a sinister life. As we stopped in front of the Scarecrow, a sudden gust of wind swept through the field, and Jim's face went deathly pale. The Scarecrow's hollow eyes seemed to fix on him, its mouth open, waiting. "Lily Mae," Jim murmured, barely audible. I didn't mean to." And then it all came spilling out, his voice broken, haunted by the weight of years of guilt. "She saw me that night. I didn't mean for her to get hurt, but she wouldn't stay quiet. I didn't have a choice. It was her life or my own." The air grew colder, and a shadow seemed to take shape beside the Scarecrow, a faint, translucent figure with long, dark hair, eyes filled with sorrow and fury. It was Lily Mae, her spirit emerging from the very soil that had hidden her for so long. Jim fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry, Lily Mae. I've carried this all my life. Please, let me be free." But Lily Mae's spirit remained unmoved. Her hand reached out, pointing at him, and in that instant, a scream tore from Jim's throat, raw and desperate. It was as if the earth itself had opened up, dragging him down. His body convulsed, racked by unseen forces, and the shadows seemed to wrap around him, pulling him closer to the Scarecrow. The Scarecrow's face twisted, its mouth stretching wide in a grotesque grin, and the ground beneath Jim cracked open. His scream turned to a strangled gurgle as he was dragged down, inch by inch, into the very earth he had tried to hide his sins within. We watched, frozen, as the soil swallowed him whole, leaving only silence and the faint outline of Lily Mae's figure, now peaceful, as she slowly faded away into the night. The Scarecrow stood in its place, silent and still, but its eyes looked different, almost relieved. Cal and I backed away, unable to speak, the horror of what we'd witnessed settling in our bones. We didn't say a word as we left the field, leaving the Scarecrow behind to watch over the land, a grim reminder of the price of buried sins. And as we walked back toward the lights of the town, we could still hear, faintly, the whisper of Lily Mae's voice, finally at peace, drifting away into the wind.